November 24th, 1971. A passenger plane climbed into the American sky. Just minutes after takeoff, a man seated in the very back row handed a small note, smiling, to a flight attendant. It contained a single sentence. What followed became the most mysterious hijacking in American history. Almost unbelievably, the hijacker collected $200,000 in ransom, then leapt from the moving aircraft into the darkened sky with nothing but a parachute, and simply disappeared from the face of the earth. More than half a century has passed since that night. Thousands of leads, hundreds of thousands of investigative hours. The FBI's best efforts thrown at this case for decades. And still, to this day, no one knows who D.B. Cooper really was. Did he survive the jump? Or did he meet his end somewhere in the dark that very night? Today, we uncover the full story behind one of the most unbelievable and still unsolved mysteries in history. That afternoon, a middle-aged man walked up to the ticket counter at Portland Airport. Black suit, black tie, a briefcase in hand, sunglasses over his eyes. Every bit the picture of an ordinary businessman. He gave his name as Dan Cooper and purchased a ticket for Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305, bound for Seattle. Just a short 45-minute hop. Back then, American airports had almost no security to speak of. No metal detectors, no baggage scanning, no ID checks. Anyone could buy a ticket under any name and walk straight onto a plane. And that's exactly what Cooper did. Once aboard, he took a seat alone in the very last row. He ordered a bourbon, lit a cigarette. Smoking wasn't banned on flights in those days, and nothing about him seemed out of the ordinary. At 2:58 that afternoon, the flight lifted off. Minutes after takeoff, Cooper called over flight attendant Florence Schaffner, who was seated nearby, and passed her a folded piece of paper, a faint smile on his face. Schaffner unfolded it and read, "I have a bomb. I want you to sit next to me." In that instant, the floor seemed to drop out from under her. Cooper motioned for her to sit, then opened his briefcase to show her what was inside. Rows of red cylinders, wires, a detonator wired to a battery. It looked unmistakably like real dynamite. There was no doubt left. This flight had just been hijacked. Cooper's demands were simple, and there were three of them. $200,000 in cash by 5 that afternoon, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck standing by the moment the plane touched down in Seattle. He made himself perfectly clear. Refuse, and he'd detonate the bomb. Florence rushed to the cockpit to relay the message. Another flight attendant, Tina Mucklow, took the seat beside Cooper, relaying messages between the pilot and the hijacker over the intercom. It was the first ransom hijacking in American history. Local authorities and the FBI moved fast, deciding to meet every one of Cooper's demands, convinced, as they were, that he had no real way off the plane. The flight that should have landed in Seattle in 45 minutes instead circled the airport for nearly an hour and a half. The other 35 passengers were told a technical issue was delaying the landing. Not one of them had any idea what was unfolding just rows behind them. In that window of time, Seattle First National Bank pulled together 10,000 $20 bills, every serial number carefully recorded so the money could be traced later. A nearby skydiving club supplied 2 sets of parachutes. At 5:45 that evening, the plane finally touched down. As promised, a bag stuffed with cash and the parachutes were loaded aboard, and the plane was refueled. With every demand met, Cooper let the 35 passengers and 2 flight attendants disembark, but ordered the pilot and remaining crew to stay aboard. Night had fallen by then. The plane climbed back into the sky. Through Tina Mucklow, Cooper now gave the pilot a specific set of instructions. He wanted the landing gear left down, the flaps open, an altitude of 10,000 feet, a speed of 200 kilometers per hour, and a destination of Mexico City. The pilot agreed to everything else, but fuel limitations made a direct flight to Mexico City impossible. So he offered a few alternate cities for refueling along the way, and Cooper settled on Reno. Meanwhile, local and federal authorities were racing to keep pace. Fighter jets were scrambled to trail the aircraft, but they couldn't hold such a slow speed, forcing them to loop around the plane in the dark night sky instead. In the meantime, Cooper told Tina Mucklow, seated beside him, to head to the cockpit where the two pilots and another flight attendant were waiting. As she turned to shut the cockpit door behind her, the last thing she saw was Cooper, tying something around his waist. What happened next has been debated for 50 years. The plane's rear stairway dropped open, and D.B. Cooper stepped out into the darkness of the night. It was around 8:10 p.m. Outside, driving rain, near freezing temperatures, dense forest and mountains below. On that night in 1971, a man, a briefcase full of cash strapped to his waist, a parachute on his back, vanished into the dark of history. Forever. 3 hours later, the plane landed in Reno, where investigators went over every inch of it. But there was no man inside, and no trace of one. Cooper had vanished into thin air. No one had seen him jump, but with the rear stairway left open, it was clear enough. He'd gone somewhere between Seattle and Reno. The FBI searched the aircraft immediately and came away with almost nothing. A black tie he'd left behind, a few cigarette butts, and one of the two parachutes, the one he'd never bothered to use. No one had so much as a photograph of him. Investigators questioned the remaining passengers and crew, and from what little they could recall, a sketch was pieced together. Figuring out exactly where Cooper had jumped became the FBI's first task. Fortunately, the plane had been on autopilot, so its flight path, altitude, and speed were all on record. The flight recorder showed the rear stairway had opened at 8:10 p.m. Using that data, investigators mapped out a probable search zone, roughly 45 square kilometers of dense forest and mountain terrain, and sent in teams by air and on the ground. Every inch was combed over. Nothing turned up. No sign of Cooper. No briefcase. No money. The area was so brutally cold that many investigators simply assumed Cooper hadn't survived the jump at all. But the deeper the investigation went, the more it seemed to raise new questions rather than answer the old ones. What came next turned the entire investigation on its head. For the first time in American history, the FBI made a public appeal for help solving a case. Cooper's sketch and the serial numbers of every one of those $200,000 were published in newspapers, and a reward was announced. Investigators reasoned that if Cooper were still alive, sooner or later he'd have to spend that money. But astonishingly, not a single one of those bills ever surfaced anywhere. The story didn't end there, though. Nearly 9 years later, in 1980, at a spot along the Columbia River in Washington state called Tina Bar, a child playing near the riverbank with his parents dug up 3 bundles of old cash buried in the sand. $5,800 in total. His parents brought the money straight to the FBI. When examined, the serial numbers matched Cooper's ransom money exactly. The first real break in the case in 9 years. But the FBI had no idea yet. This discovery wouldn't solve the mystery. It would deepen it. Because here's where the investigation took its strangest turn. The money had surfaced roughly 27 kilometers from the presumed jump site. At first, investigators guessed it might have drifted there via the Lewis River into the Columbia, but the Columbia flows in exactly the opposite direction. Then came another detail. The very spot where the cash was found had been freshly covered with new sand back in 1974, 3 years after the hijacking. and the money was buried right beneath that layer, which meant the cash hadn't drifted there at all. Someone had deliberately buried it. Cooper himself, perhaps, or an accomplice. The FBI went on to question dozens of men who resembled Cooper's description, but nothing solid ever came of it. Some investigators believed he may have been a trained military man. The parachute he'd taken with him was military grade, difficult to operate without proper training. Yet the one he'd left behind on the plane was a far simpler civilian model, one anyone could use without any training at all. Aside from the $5,800 recovered in 1980, none of the remaining 9,700 bills has ever surfaced to this day. Even now, the FBI's entire body of evidence comes down to a handful of items: Cooper's sketch, the ticket bearing his handwritten name, and that black tie, its clip fastened on the left side. From that one small detail, investigators formed a theory. D.B. Cooper may have been left-handed. It's not proof of anything, just a possibility worth noting. For 50 years, this case has kept the FBI locked in a spiral of unanswered questions. To this day, every detail remains posted on the FBI's website. The file, officially, has never been closed. A man, a black tie, a briefcase, a leap into the dark of night. That's all that remains of D.B. Cooper. Not his real name, not his face, not even how his story ended. America's most powerful investigative agency, thousands of agents, 50 years of searching, all of it defeated by one man who may have vanished into those mountains that very night, or who may still be alive somewhere, carrying his secret in silence. On cold nights, when the wind sweeps through those Washington forests, it almost feels like the sound of that parachute is still out there, drifting somewhere in the dark. Who was D.B. Cooper? The question remains one of the deepest voids in American history, an answer that may never come, forever out of reach. So that's the story of D.B. Cooper, the man who vanished into the sky and never came back down. If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories just like this one. See you in the next mystery.